Welcome to the March Promising Practices webinar, Communities for Climate Action, Engagement Strategies That Work. My name is Rebecca Trout, and I direct the National Civic League's All-America City Award Program in DC office and have the pleasure of hosting this monthly webinar series. Just a little bit of background on the League for those of you less familiar with us. Our mission is to advance inclusive civic engagement and promote innovations and democracy to make decision-making more participatory, equitable, and ultimately more effective. We were founded way back when in 1894 by a group of reformists led by Teddy Roosevelt and Louis Brandeis. We're making us the oldest good governance organization. We championed many of the democracy innovations that you might know about from the early 20th century, and we like to think that we're positioned and working on doing that again today. Just a little bit of background on some of the ways that we do our work. Right now, we maintain the Model City Charter, we organize the All-America City Award event, publish the National Civic Review, and support an extensive national network of local elected, appointed, and civic leaders. And then also our Center for Democracy work, innovation works with public officials in the US to really understand, kind of test and try out, and then disseminate the next generation of civic innovations, which we are hoping will make democracy more participatory. Many of those ideas and innovations unearthed by that center end up being featured in All-America City Award programs and webinars such as these. I would be a very bad program director of the All-America City Award if I did not take the opportunity to do a little plug for this year's award. You might notice on this slide that our due date has passed, which is very exciting. We have a really great batch of applications right now that we are in the process of sending out to our review committee and getting those scored and reviewed. And we're going to be naming the 20 finalists for this year next week, actually. So please stay tuned for that. And you can learn from some really great communities doing work around environmental sustainability. So many of you on the call, I know, might be interested in some of the promising practices that are coming out of those communities. And of course, we'll be sharing some of those promising practices from our speakers today. So without further ado, I do want to go ahead and introduce our wonderful lineup of speakers today. We are going to be joined by Peter Zahn, who's the Vice President of Strategy at the Local Policy Lab. I'm sorry, co-founder and Vice President of Strategy at Local Policy Lab. Also, Christine Lopes-Metcalf, she is Chief of Staff with Local Policy Lab. And then we'll be hearing from two really great communities that are doing this work on the ground. Representing City of Missoula, Montana is Lee Ratterman. She is their Climate and Sustainability Specialist. And then Crystal Nahara from the Sustainability Manager at the City of Encinitas. They've got some really great things and ideas to share with you. We'll be featuring some Q&A at the very end of the webinar. So please feel free to write your questions in the chat, but you can also use the raise hand feature and have more of a conversation with us towards the end of the webinar. A couple of other items, housekeeping related. I'm asking that everyone please remain muted out of respect for our speakers. We know we've got those pesky dogs in our backgrounds that we want to keep quiet. And again, put your questions in the chat. We are going to be recording, and we'll send that recording as well as these slides out to you either later today or early tomorrow. So don't feel like you need to furiously take notes. We'll be sure to send you the content so you can revisit it in the future. And now, without further ado, I'm going to hand it off to our first speaker, Christine. Christine, welcome.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you to everyone who's with us today. We're so excited to be here. As Rebecca mentioned, my name is Christine Lopes-Metcalf. I'm the Chief of Staff at the Local Policy Lab, and so I'm going to start to share my screen and just provide a little bit of background on the Local Policy Lab, which we call LPL, and then also talk a little bit about one of our projects, and then you'll hear more from Lee on that, and a project that we worked on in the City of Missoula. So first, there we go. We tried this technology. It always fails when you don't want it to work. The Local Policy Lab was started about 3 years ago, really with the idea of helping small and mid-sized cities on how to engage with residents to strengthen democracy and address climate. And our mission is exactly that. It really is supporting local governments in order to really kind of strengthen those bonds with residents in order to both address climate and address, civic engagement. And then through the years, since the LPL is a little bit younger than the National Civic League, we've also been focused in on the intersection between climate and democracy, which has been some really exciting work and led us to working more closely with the city of Missoula. LPL focuses, let me do our slide deck, focuses our work in 4 main areas. First, we work intensely with cities, and so we provide supports directly to cities. We work with them on either developing plans. We don't have any prescribed kind of solution to how to engage residents. We try to meet cities where they are and then flesh out plans, whether it's working on civic assemblies or citizen assemblies, participatory budgeting, a variety of topics. Our second pillar is we try to work to connect cities. And so through the LPL network, what we do is we have cities come together, have conversations about different topics. We provide monthly conversations. We also provide democracy briefs and different reports. Anyone who's interested in the LPL network, we're always excited to have new people kind of join and learn more about what we're doing, what other cities are doing to engage residents and to tackle climate. And so feel free to reach out. Our emails will be at the end. And then our fourth pillar and our fourth area focus is really around our action lab. So we know that we're a small team that is based across the country, but we know that we can really only help only a certain number of cities. And so what we try to do through our action lab is share all the things that we're learning in innovative ways and share them out across the country to have more of an impact. And so we do that through a variety of ways, either traditional case studies, but we're also looking into the utilization of, artificial intelligence and AI tools and different things to help local governments learn what's going on in different parts of the country. And then our fourth area is really this idea of mobilizing both cities, local governments, funders, nonprofits who are all in support of engaging residents and building that ecosystem and helping mobilize it towards that greater good. I just wanted to provide a quick snapshot of kind of the cities that are in our network currently, or cities that we've worked with across the country. We are nonpartisan. We really focus in on engaging everybody where they are and really enjoy connecting cities. So this is just a little snapshot of that. Next, I'm just going to quickly touch on and hand over to Peter quickly, is our work with Missoula. So our work intensely with cities kind of focus area was we had worked with Missoula when LPL first started through a climate cohort. We then reached back out to them with an opportunity to kind of dive in a little bit deeper on climate and democracy. They were interested in focusing in on task forces. And so what we did at LPL was we actually created a civic engagement roadmap for the city. We focused in on task forces because that was something of interest for them, but we also provided some other recommendations on other ways to get residents engaged in climate and civic engagement. But the task force project itself led us to think through kind of what are some of the key components to putting together a task force. And that in and of itself, many of you may have been part of one or know of one, isn't new. But the idea of trying to innovate on process is something we've been trying to encourage cities to do, to think about things that they may have done in the past, but do it a little bit differently or implement things that might be helpful. And so these are the 8 key components in the roadmap that we provided to Missoula that we can talk about a little bit about it, whether it was helpful. Hopefully it has been so far. They're about to kick off their process. Focused in on these areas. But some of the benefits that we saw from researching and talking to some cities around the country was that the use of task forces in and of themselves around climate would be helpful, but they also started to see some byproducts of it, where when you have a task force that's time limited and it's only for a set period of time, you get to engage residents that may not otherwise want to engage with local government. And what they saw was that residents that did that then sought out other opportunities to engage, whether they wanted to run for office or be on commissions or committees. And so that was a great byproduct. And also just the idea of sharing information and creating two-way communication with residents. It wasn't just to share information, but it was to get new ideas. And so we heard back that the other benefits were that climate sustainability or other local governments were bringing together residents that had content expertise in a particular area, but they also had residents who were experts in the community, kind of the people who have the pulse of the neighborhood and know how to get information out. They were coming together to work on a particular topic. So with that, that was just a quick kind of what LPL is and a little bit of our task force work with Missoula. I'm going to hand it over to Peter to talk more about our work on the intersection between climate and democracy.
Oh, thanks, Christine. And yeah, Peter's on with Local Policy Lab. It's great to be with everyone. I'm going to briefly introduce the Climate Plus Democracy Toolkit, which we produced in collaboration with the Evolution Affairs Group in San Diego. We developed the toolkit to help cities and other local government bodies to more effectively use the democratic process to make better climate policy. And the policy could be a climate action plan, it could be a climate-related grant, or a discrete issue. So before we get to the real-life engagement scenarios in Missoula and Encinitas, I'm going to touch on 7 steps that any city can use to effectively engage its residents. Christine dropped a link to the toolkit in the chat. If you open it, you'll see it's loaded with actions, tools, and worksheets for various steps. So to start with the first step, it's to identify the opportunity and outcomes for your city. Your city is trying to achieve with a particular climate-related project or action. So, for example, if a city identifies the need for a flood control project due to excessive river flooding events, you should understand the specific climate challenges the community faces and articulate the purpose of the project. Because once you know the purpose and outcomes, then you're better positioned to hold a meaningful conversation with the community or other stakeholders that you engage. Step 2 is to identify your agency's limitations, as the slide says, and gauge its internal commitment to empowering the community. So here, the kit has a tool called the Spectrum of Public Participation. Basically, it's a guide that helps the city to determine the level of engagement that the city seeks to achieve. And moving on to step 3, in simple terms, it's really to identify whose input you need for a successful and inclusive outcome. So using the stakeholder analysis matrix in the toolkit, you can determine who the stakeholders are and the strategy for engaging them. So after determining the project's purpose and desired outcomes and whose input you need and the strategy for engaging the stakeholders, in step 4, you assemble that into a mini stakeholder outreach plan. The plan will include tactics like creating a project webpage, for example, developing a timeline with milestones, defining your expected outcomes like building credibility and momentum. And then as we're rolling through here, step 5 involves convening stakeholders and receiving feedback in the most effective, inclusive way. This is where the rubber hits the road. This is where you solicit the community's insights about their ideal outcomes, and you do it in a transparent process. If there's a lot of complexity to the issue or it's ongoing, then convening an advisory board or a task force that Christine was mentioning, or a working group could be considered. Next slide, please. And start, that brings us to the post-engagement step 6, where it's important that stakeholders are well informed about the program's outcomes and challenges and future plans. Different communications are available for this, of course, like social media, public events, published reports that share data based on the output that was received from the public are very effective. And then finally, in step 7, assessment is often the most overlooked area, but it's where we see if the engagement objectives were met, and how we can improve in the future. Reflection on measures like inclusivity, communication levels, community participation levels, they're all valuable here, as is feedback through interviews and surveys of those who participated in the engagement activities. So that's a quick rundown of steps to effective engagement. Local Policy Lab, we're open to feedback and suggestions about the toolkit and all our activities. We're nonprofit, and all the services that we offer to local governments are free of charge. And I want to thank Rebecca and the team at National Civic League. And now I'll hand it over to Lee Ratterman at Missoula.
Thank you so much. Can everybody hear me okay? Great. I was having a little audio issue earlier, so I'm glad it's working. So my name is Lee Ratterman. I'm a climate and sustainability specialist with the city of Missoula, Montana. And if you'll just give me 1 second, I'm going to share my slide deck here. So yeah, as I mentioned, climate and sustainability specialist with the city of Missoula. We are a smaller municipality. We have just under 80,000 people in the city of Missoula, and we have some pretty lofty climate action goals for our city. We have a goal of carbon neutrality by 2025 in our municipal operations. That's this year, and sadly, I can probably announce that we will not reach carbon neutrality this year as a city. We have a goal of carbon neutrality by 2050 community-wide. We have a goal of 100% clean electricity by 2030. We have a climate-ready, climate resilience plan, and then we also have a zero waste by 2050 goal. As a municipality, we really face some challenges in terms of implementation, both locally in terms of funding and capacity issues, on the state level with lack of local authority to make rules, and then of course on the federal level with kind of potentially lack of funding to implement our goals moving forward. And so yeah, we're always trying to consider innovative and creative ways to meet our climate action goals, given a lot of those barriers that we face. And we are a community that is very susceptible to the effects of climate change. And so we, during the summer, experience wildfire and extreme wildfire smoke issues. We're increasingly and perhaps surprisingly experiencing extreme heat for extended periods of time. We're seeing drought across our state. We're seeing floods across our state. We're seeing increasing extreme weather patterns. We had a windstorm move through last summer that had hurricane strength winds that we've never seen before and basically decimated a large percentage of our urban forest. So we have a lot of challenges, and we feel a lot of urgency as a community to put these climate action goals into action. So we as a municipality have not been leaders in citizen engagement. A lot of our citizen engagement work historically has been kind of farmed out to our nonprofit community, and we support them through grants and collaborative work. But really, we've really relied on our community partners to do a lot of this citizen engagement work. We haven't just kind of had the capacity to do it in the past. When I first started at the city of Missoula, I was the only climate and sustainability staff. And now we're a team of 3, which is big for us, but given our goals, we still face challenges with capacity. We did have a city council appointed energy and climate team. And this team was started in the late 90s and really preceded any sort of staff at the city. And they were the voice of climate action in the city of Missoula for a long time. But as we're looking at city efficiencies and different kind of methods of citizen engagement, our mayor directed the city as a whole to take a look at all boards and commissions. And ultimately, we decided to sunset the energy and climate team. It was about a 10-member board, as I mentioned, it's city council appointed. And there were just some growing pains around who advised who and who had authority over what. And we just felt it wasn't the most effective model moving forward. And lucky for us as a municipality at that time, I got an email from Local Policy Lab offering to work together on our citizen engagement strategy. It felt very serendipitous because it was just perfect timing. I had met the Local Policy Lab previously through a cohort around climate resilience that we worked on together. And so just felt really grateful that we were kind of chosen as a community to pilot some of this work with. We were hearing and are hearing from our community a desire for more engagement, more connectedness, more information sharing about what are we doing, especially as we are seeing more effects of climate change in our community. And there's just really, like I said, the sense of urgency around what are we doing? How do we get that information out there? And then how do we collaborate with our community to make sure that our priorities align with everybody's needs? So kind of our first step, what local policy asked us to do within this process is to really understand as a city team, like, why does this work matter to us? And so this is just a little slide to kind of show what we came up with as our 3-person team. And then we kind of brought in some other city staff as well to just talk about why we're doing this work and why engagement around climate change is important to us. And so things like protecting our natural resources, transparency to our community, to make sure that our community feels included, and that we can make the most change with the limited resources that we have. So we came up with in the green box, the kind of statement around why we're doing the work that we're doing. And essentially, it's all of those things: transparency, public buy-in, incorporate the lived experience to maximize the success of our projects, designed to mitigate and help make sure our community is resilient to the effects of climate change. So that's the why. And so we began working with Local Policy Lab to really understand what that might look like in Missoula. And as our partners at the Local Policy Lab just presented on, they really created a kind of tailored, specific roadmap for us. And they did that through a number of ways. They conducted a lot of stakeholder meetings ahead of a visit to Missoula, but then they actually came and spent a couple days with us, and we were able to interview folks. We were able to host these large stakeholder meetings of internal stakeholders and external stakeholders, and really do some deep dive planning to understand our needs and understand the needs of the city as a larger entity. So why task forces? Within all of that research and within kind of the Local Policy Lab creating a larger roadmap for us, we realized that task forces are really just a first step within a broader toolkit of citizen engagement strategies. So task forces are not the end-all be-all of the work that we plan to do in the future, but they felt like a really tangible place to start, given our lack of capacity and all of the other barriers that I talked about earlier. And being able to kind of convene groups of community members around specific project needs would actually, we think, or will actually increase our capacity, because now we're kind of building teams of folks who can help us work and help us implement and actually make the change in our community, or help advise on the change needed within our community that maybe just the 3 of us staff members can't do on our own. We've spent a lot of time kind of trying to figure out what topics we might be interested in putting task forces together for. And so I've just listed out a few, potentially around a deconstruction incentive program in our community. We're launching a food waste awareness week. We're putting together a plan around electric vehicle charging infrastructure. And then the one we've actually landed on as our first task force is a roadmap for our zero waste goal. So I mentioned we have a goal of zero waste by 2050. That's a long time off. The roadmap is for that is kind of overwhelming and large. And so we're going to put together a task force to really help us narrow that down to a 3 to 5 year roadmap of actionable and feasible projects that we can actually accomplish within our community, given our current status. And so our next steps, the Local Policy Lab has given us kind of our plan, which includes task forces, but then also opens up larger. We've also been having, as a result of this work, a conversation with our larger city entity around using this work that we're doing as a climate team as a model for city engagement as a whole at the city. And so our leadership at the city is interested in doing this work as well. And so how do we kind of use what we've learned here, but then open that up to all of the work the city does? We have lots of lofty and competing priorities at the city. We have, as many municipalities do, we have a affordable housing issue, we have homelessness issues and climate issues, and we're really trying to figure out how do we talk to our city about all of those things. Local Policy Lab not only has provided us with everything I've talked about, but they're also going to do some hand-holding for our first initial task force, and they're going to really support us to make sure that from beginning to end, this is a functional, efficient, and actionable task force, and that we can kind of follow up with all of the pieces that Peter talked about in terms of making sure that members feel like they're doing work and that we can follow up and let them know how that work is going to be used in the future. And yeah, we just continue to meet with Local Policy Lab and have conversations like this around lessons learned and continue to improve as we move along. We really see this as a process, not just a thing that we're doing or a project that we're doing. So I think that's it for me. And with that, we're going to hear from another community, Encinitas, California, and Crystal is here to talk about her work.
Thank you, everyone. Let me just get that up here. Okay, can you see my slides? Okay, yep, okay, great. Awesome. Well, thank you for having me. I'm excited to share with you some of our experiences with engaging the community. The picture that you see here on the screen is our beautiful coastline that we have here in Encinitas. Encinitas is located in California in the San Diego region, and we're one of the northern county coastal cities. So I guess environmental and the nature here is definitely top of mind for our public. So that's very helpful when you have that, and then you can kind of support their interests through the work that you do for the city. So what I'm going to talk about is, I will also start off with kind of introducing our climate action plan, and then I'll share some of the efforts that we made to actually work on implementing a few of the measures that were in the plan. So we adopted our most recent climate action plan in 2018, and on the right part of your screen is the pie chart of our emissions sources in our city. So a little over half of the emissions come from transportation, and then the remaining portion, the large majority of that, comes from our building stock. So natural gas and electricity largely is that those emissions are produced by buildings either burning natural gas within the building to generate some sort of energy usage, or electricity being delivered to the building to generate whatever energy is needed. So what I am going to focus on for this is how we came up with some of our building permits, our ordinances, to actually require more efficient buildings in our community. So this is the list of the 8 measures that relate to our building permit related. So they have to do with residential and commercial energy efficiency and decarbonization, installing solar, installing EV charging stations, and these are at both new and alterations, additions, or retrofits, or they're sometimes called. The first step in tackling these measures is actually establishing the codes or building codes within our city that any proposed new building or addition or retrofit would have to comply with in order to meet these more efficient requirements. So and then the first step in doing that, this is kind of the flow chart of the process to do such a thing, actually to adopt an ordinance to enact those codes. And what we built in is all the blue boxes, which are where we engage the public. So as you can see throughout the whole process, actually the majority of the process really was to engage the public and to hear from them on what their interests were in terms of these requirements or potential requirements. So in 8 different stages along this process, we were engaging the public. We started with an overall overview workshop where we had invited everyone to have an in-person, at that time it was during COVID, so it was a virtually in-person meeting to hear about the project, get a kind of basic understanding of the project, and then we invited those that were interested to join our stakeholder group. We wanted a very diverse and broad stakeholder group. So we wanted residents, we wanted business owners, we also wanted developers, those that would be affected by the code, to participate in it. We wanted environmental advocates to be a part of it. And then we also wanted representatives from our Environmental Commission, which is a recommending body of our city council. So we We advertised largely about the opportunity to be a part of the stakeholder group. Initially, we had planned to have kind of one representative from each of our different interest areas. And in the end, we received 13 applications and decided actually that rather than kind of, you know, condensing that to a smaller subset, we figured we would just, we could handle 13 members of our stakeholder group. So we just invited them all to be a part of the stakeholder group. So they all attended 2 meetings where we spoke very much in depth about the potential options and different designs of how we could frame the code. And the goal with those meetings was really to come to a consensus with all 13 members. So there was a lot of discussion, a lot of sharing of perspectives and concerns and interests. And in the end, we actually did come up with a recommended draft of the ordinance that was supported by the full stakeholder group. And then we had consultants draft a draft of that ordinance, and then we shared that out at a public workshop. And then at that time, we held a public comment period and offered that anyone from the workshop, or if you didn't have an opportunity to attend the workshop, you'd still had a chance to review the draft ordinance and provide comments. And then we considered all those comments, incorporated those that seemed relevant, and then had that final draft of the ordinance that we eventually took to our environmental commission for consideration, and hoping to have them recommend that council adopt the ordinance. So that was another point of public input opportunity. There's always a an opportunity for the public to speak at those meetings and share their interests and concerns during those the consideration of those items. And then after that was the vote was made to recommend that the ordinance go to council. During the council meeting, there was 2 additional opportunities to have your voice heard during the first and second readings of an ordinance. So that kind of rounds out how we incorporated public outreach. And then I just wanted to share kind of how this played out. So like I said, there's just a listing of those 13 representatives and the 2 stakeholder meetings that we held, in which we discussed and the development of the draft language. And then largely we focused on electrification. That was the kind of the new and of top interest in terms of a potential requirement in our city to require new buildings to be built all electrically. So there was definitely some hesitance and concern with that. And so how we approached that issue specifically was we kind of laid it out for the stakeholder group so they could see what it might look like visually, depending on the different appliances that are within residential and commercial and different types of commercial establishments. So there's kind of 3 buckets here that I wanted to quickly kind of go over with you. So 3 categories. So there's the residential buildings on the far left. Those are largely our single family residential buildings. And we took a look at what proportion of the energy usage comes from electricity versus natural gas in a home, or and then kind of a breakdown of how much the different appliances utilize in terms of that energy. And so this was data that we were supplied by some consultants that are technical experts in this area. So as it turns out, in single family homes, typically about half of your energy is used to heat water, and then another 30% is used for space heating. And then cooking appliances is about 8%, clothes drying is 4%. If you have a pool or a spa, that's usually around 4%, and then there's a small category of other. And so a lot of the topic that we heard in the stakeholder meeting was just concerns different people had about the particular appliances, especially cooking appliances was something that people had a very strong interest in cooking with natural gas, and felt like that should be preserved and that there should be an exception carved out for that interest. And so that is what we ended up doing. We ended up recommending that there would be an exception for cooking appliances, and then also pool and spa heating, because that can get quite costly if you use electricity only to heat your pool or spa. So I won't go through them all, but we did kind of a similar exercise with multifamily residential buildings in the middle, and then also with restaurants on the far end, which were like a particular specialty use case that we wanted to consider. You can see the major difference here is that cooking appliances makes up 78% of the energy usage in a restaurant. And so because that was their really the core of the restaurant's business is how they cook, we felt like that too should be a special carve out for that particular business, because it could be so impactful to require them to convert to electric appliances only. So here's just a summary of the input that we heard during the stakeholder meetings and the other general public input. I won't go over all of this, but what I want to highlight here is the responses under category 3. So this has to do with the electrification components for new buildings. So there was what we landed on, and after hearing all the public input, was that we would require that the electric only appliances would be water heaters, heating and air conditioning, clothes drying, and fireplaces. And we carved out exceptions for cooking, pools and spas, outdoor fireplaces, central water heating for multifamily, restaurants, and then also ADUs. And this was all based on what we heard from the public. And then just kind of a summary of support or against. So we had 4 public comments that were in support, 11 that were in support if we had made revisions, and then 3 that were opposed. The public wanted us to prioritize energy efficiency. Some wanted us to remove the electric exceptions. There was some support for the exception of the cooking appliances, though. Some were concerned about the loss of freedom of choice. And finally, there was an interest in having the city provide rebates and incentives for some of these changes. So this is a summary of kind of what we ended up with in terms of regulations. Overall, there were 4 new regulations that went into our different code sections, and they affected both retrofit and new buildings. The all electric requirement is that second one there, all electric construction of new buildings. So that would have impacted all new buildings in the city. And then this is my final slide, just kind of sharing the outcome when we did finally take it to council. Interestingly enough, after all of that stakeholder input we received and the balanced ordinance that was proposed with those 6 exceptions built in, our city council actually had a different take on what they wanted in terms of a requirement. And when we took the ordinance for the first reading, they actually directed staff to remove 3 of the 6 exceptions. So the residential cooking, pool, spas, and fireplaces, that one was removed. The exception for ADUs was removed. And then also the exception for high-rise residential central water heaters was removed. And then they asked staff to reevaluate and narrow the exceptions for 2, 4, and 6. So this is kind of, I guess, part of the moral of this is, of course, it's great to have public input, and that's really supportive of helping your decision makers make their decisions. But ultimately, they are the ones that are elected and can further refine and provide direction. Of course, taking into account what they heard from the public, but also taking into account what their perspectives are as well. And I will lastly end on that this wasn't the end of the story for this ordinance. We since have had to kind of modify it based on some legal action that was taken in another city and the state, but that legal action did affect our ordinance as well. So we don't have an entirely all electric ordinance anymore, but we do have a electric encouraged ordinance and a very strong high performance energy efficiency ordinance that we have in place right now. And so that wraps up my presentation, and happy to hand it back to, I think I'm handing it back to Rebecca. And I'll stop sharing.
Great. Thank you so much, Crystal,
Yeah.
Lee, and Peter, and Christine. Appreciate all of your time. We've got some. Sorry, I'm just going to try to get us back into
Thanks.
gallery mode here. There we go. So that was a lot to take in. Some really rich content there. Thank you so much. We've got a couple of questions in the chat, and then I have a couple of things that I wanted to talk with everyone about as well. Everyone should feel free to either put further questions into the chat or use the raise hand feature on Zoom, and we'll call on you and have a little bit more of a conversation here. We do have a little over 15 minutes for Q&A, so that's great. So please don't be shy. Okay, so our first question really came after that the mention of Crystal of the revisions that City Council had to the public input suggestions, and just sort of how people felt about that, and how that impacted participant perspectives of the feedback loop.
Yeah, I think it was taken as a bit of a surprise, especially because there was so much put into working towards a consensus style ordinance. So while it was a surprise, and it once it was in place, there was a little bit more work that needed to be done on staff's end because there was, especially with the development sector, that was who we heard from the most, I guess I would say, is their concern on how they would meet the requirement. And so yeah, I guess I'll leave it. In the end, like I said, it has been revised since then to something that's a little bit more balanced, but yeah, that was something that we did hear from the community, that they were potentially having a challenge to actually implement that on their projects.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is something that engagement professionals, across the country have to deal with, and have to factor in, what happens when you do all of this hard work of, engaging the public, and then it is not necessarily listened to, and then how do you go back to them again? It makes things tricky, but I appreciate you sharing that. And then we had a question here for Lee, our other speaker. There's a question about how much the University of Montana was engaged in Missoula's climate goals.
We work very closely with the University of Montana on lots of our climate action work. And so I'm not sure the plans and goals precede my time at the city, but I do know that they were brought in as stakeholders. The University of Montana has its own sustainability coordinator and sustainability team. And so, yeah, we work collaboratively, but almost like two separate entities within the same community.
Cool. And then I had a question for you about sort of the switch from kind of outsourcing a lot of your engagement work to taking a lot more of that in-house, and just sort of how that change happened, and any sort of stumbling blocks or successes that you've seen from moving from one model to the other.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I'll say we're just kind of at the beginning of doing that public engagement work as a city entity. And I wouldn't say we're necessarily taking it from one to the other, but we're just adding to it. And so our community partners are still supported and collaborators on all of the work that we do. And so they're still out there doing a lot of citizen engagement. And then we're just trying to understand what's the city of Missoula's specific role in community engagement, and then how do we share the work that we do, essentially, to kind of provide that level of transparency that I mentioned to our community.
Yeah. Absolutely. That's great. I think we've got some folks from the city of Seattle on, and I know they've got a little bit of a hybrid model as well, where the city definitely does some direct engagement work, but they work very, very hand in hand with a number of community partners and those sort of trusted stakeholders that can reach communities and populations that don't always interface with the city. So that's great to hear. And then this next question is for Peter and or Christine, more in regards to the toolkit. And I think this was answered in the chat, but I just wanted to pull that out into conversation as well. The question was about whether or not the toolkit included a template for a work plan, and if not, is a template or sample work plan available?
Yeah, I can take that. Yes, I mentioned in response, there's like templates and exercises that help to arrive at elements of a work plan, but there's not a full work plan template in the toolkit. And there is a link, by the way, to the toolkit in the chat. So, but we can dig one out and get a sample out to Paul and whoever else would like one.
Thank you so much. Wonderful. All right, feel free to keep those questions coming in the chat. In the meantime, I just get to pepper everybody with my own questions. So my question is really, you know, I'm based here in DC, and there's a lot of very vocal pushback happening at the national level right now about sort of climate work and sustainability. And I'm just curious how and if that perception has changed any of the work that you're doing, if you're feeling it yet, sort of what the impact on just kind of like any of the rhetoric around your work has been, or, you know, if it's more kind of business as usual and you're still seeing a lot of community buy-in into this work.
I could jump in first and then pass it to you, Crystal, if that works. We are definitely seeing some impacts in terms of, we spent a couple of years planning around the Inflation Reduction Act and planning for which grants we would apply for and how we were going to use that money to implement a lot of the work and programs. And now that money might not be there. And so we're really kind of trying to pivot and understand, well, how can we still implement and make change and move the needle without these opportunities that we were kind of counting on. And I think the conversation has shifted a little bit from kind of that bigger picture view to, okay, this work is now more important than ever in our local municipality. And so really trying to frame it, if possible, in kind of a positive way of like all hands on deck locally to make change.
Yeah, I will share. To be honest, I don't think in terms of our public's perspective and our city council's perspective, even though we've got 3 new council members and a new mayor on our council this year, and they are more conservative leaning. I still do think that there's very much a lot of support for the city's climate action plan and doing this work locally. We have seen a little bit of drop off in funding and grant opportunities, but I feel like the state of California still does have a substantial amount of opportunity for grants as well. And so the sting has not been quite so great here in Southern California, but still not as, it's always better when you have the support of the federal government. So it is making it a little bit more challenging. So yeah.
Thank you for sharing.
I would jump in, Rebecca, also that what we're seeing at Local Policy Lab, and we're still trying to collect information, is more concerned about funding being cut off, and where it's not necessarily widespread, but it's definitely happening, or there's a chilling effect in terms of taking risks to make investments by cities if they're uncertain about where things are going to go. So, and actually, if there's any other, any information, anyone on this webinar that would like to let us know what they've experienced, we are collecting that information for the purpose of really helping provide guidance to our network and to cities at large.
That's great, Peter. Thank you so much for sharing sort of what you all are doing and some of the data that you're collecting. The National Civic League's All-America City Award program is happening this year in June. And as I mentioned, we're focused on recognizing communities that are strengthening environmental sustainability. And so that is one of the kind of, workshop topics and, programmatic areas we're trying to build out with this year's event, is to kind of provide some folks with potential funding ideas, or even to just gather people around to talk about, how people are pivoting. So, please be on the lookout for that. And I know that we'll be sharing any resources that we find or any answers that we end up finding. And I imagine that Local Policy Lab will be doing that as well. And then just encourage everyone on this call to, to share any resources or any of their own experience with kind of the changing climate. No pun intended. All right. So another question from the chat here, and I might have her jump on to explain further. Is a question from, I think it's Faduma. Are the engagement strategies being utilized in your communities? Are they being utilized as a policy movement building initiative? Faduma, would you mind actually coming off mute and talking to us a little bit about what you mean by that?
Sure. Thank you,
Sorry to put you
everyone.
on the spot.
No worries. And this is more in relation to the work that's happening in Washington, specifically at the city of Seattle and Washington State. We are utilizing assemblies as a policy movement building tool. One, to create more awareness around issues folks have around climate justice, and whether they work directly with climate justice and environmental justice, or overall intersect around economic justice, health, wellness. So we're using it as a sort of to create more awareness about around lived experience and where they transact with policies or program improvements at the local level, and more ways to nudge civic muscle, so that even outside of these assemblies and engagements, whether they're task force or advisory groups, that they overall become involved in the policy space. I'm wondering if, given that even if some of the outcomes aren't realized, what happens with the audience that was convened? How are they empowered to engage in other forms?
I can take
I
a
guess.
stab at the beginning.
Okay.
I
Okay,
was
go ahead.
I'll take a stab at the beginning. And I'm glad that you mentioned the idea of the engagement strategies as being towards building something bigger. And I think you had mentioned the civic assemblies. I think that's definitely a space that we're seeing where communities are trying to engage residents through these civic and citizen assemblies, but with the intention of possibly institutionalizing those tools so it's not just one-off. So that's one avenue. And I think to your later question about what happens when some of these things end and how do you keep people involved in the policy conversations. And I know one of the things that we worked on and hope to continue working on with Missoula in that task force work was this idea of making sure that our recommendations were that once a task force, and just using them as an example, is complete. So they're set up for a period of time, 6 or 9 months, they do their charge and then they disband. But the importance of making sure that there's touch points with them even after they've disbanded, so that whatever recommendations they've made, they can see how they've actually impacted either directly into policy, whether or not they've actually made a direct impact into any changes in the community. And then from there, in one community that we talked with, not in the climate space, but in a different place, is that some of the task force members had worked on a project, they made recommendations to their town council, it was accepted, but then the town council said, well, we now want to implement these things. We need a group to kind of help us. And so some of the task force members are going to stay on in an advisory capacity. And so I think there are ways to ensure, to your point of that these engagement strategies, and Lee mentioned it, that they're not just one-offs, but they're connected to a larger kind of community change of how you're continuously having residents as part of the conversation and the policy development. I don't know if others have thoughts about that.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. I think the continuity is key in terms of having that whatever the body is, the assembly. For us, it's our environmental commission that is an advisory body to our city council that was established right around the same time as our first climate action plan. And so that really helps to continue the conversation and have a have, keep the environmental issues top of mind for our council. The other thing that's really important that I'm sure Lee can also appreciate is that having dedicated staff for something like climate or whatever is most important to your community, having that dedicated staff that can not only establish the plan, but also implement the plan is really key. There's so many times we hear about city plans getting developed and then they get put on the shelf and they never get implemented. It's really critical with a climate action plan that's full of proposals to develop policy, create initiatives, install projects. All those things are really tangible project management efforts that actually need to be done once the plan has been approved. So that's really key. And I think what really helped our city to be continuing to march forward is that we have that dedicated staff. Now it's actually a division of multiple staff that are working to implement our climate action plan. And then we do, in addition to the Environmental Commission, we'll convene other related stakeholder groups as we're developing those projects, various projects that are within the climate action plan.
And I would just add real quickly that at Local Policy Lab, we're pretty deeply involved with helping cities find their way with citizen assemblies. It's relatively new, at least recently, in our country. It's an innovation that really came from Europe, but very powerful. And in fact, we're working with Fort Collins, Colorado right now on a project along with other nonprofits, and there are funders and there are other stakeholders involved, but I encourage everyone to dig into this area. It's pretty exciting and powerful, and let us know if we can help in any way.
Thanks for chiming in on that question in the chat, Peter. And then I'll just sort of, and yes, on that, we're seeing, I think, thankfully, this sort of European innovation of citizen assemblies slowly but surely make their way to the United States, and a huge uptick in interest in the last couple of years, and some really good people who are doing some great work in local communities to implement those. And those are really designed to tackle what some might call wicked problems, those ones that just are full of trade-offs and don't have a clear, easy solution, and need sort of a lot of robust, not just participation, but deliberation. I know we're doing work through Civic Genius and Mill Creek, and Local Policy Lab, as Peter mentioned, is doing some work through Fort Collins. So feel free to touch base with either of us if that is something that your community is considering. All right. Well, good job, team. We have made it to the end of our hour together. I really want to thank everyone so much for your time, specifically Crystal and Lee, taking the time out of your everyday duties to share those experiences and best practices and all of that with us here. And Peter and Christine, my friends at Local Policy Lab. Always a pleasure to work and collaborate with you. And then last but not least, to all of you wonderful attendees for taking some time out of your day to be here with us and to continue learning about civic engagement and climate action and some ways that you can enhance your work locally. And as I mentioned earlier, the recording and slides will be mailed out or emailed out to you all either later today or first thing in the morning. We'll include everybody's email addresses and the toolkit and any other resources that were mentioned in today's call. Feel free to reach out to any of us if you have any questions that we weren't able to quite get to today. All right, and with that, I will say goodbye. Enjoy the rest of your day, everybody. Bye-bye.